prosperous future for her nation. For almost 2 decades, Judy and her husband, Boomer, have owned top-notch oilfield contracting, providing good jobs and opportunity throughout our area. Judy has been a very vocal advocate for her community and for developing our abundant natural resources in northern BC. Judy is a busy mom to Trinity Angel Dawson and deeply loves and respects her 81-year-old granny, Elder May Dominic. We all congratulate Judy on her election, and I look forward to working with her. Judy, may God continue to bless you and guide you as the mantle of leadership at the Blueberry is placed on your very capable shoulders. Lead on, Judy, lead on.
The Honourable Member for London North Centre.
Mr. Speaker, the past few weeks have made clear that our democracy can and is being threatened. Constituents are rightly asking what the federal government is doing on their behalf. The invocation of the Emergencies Act is an extraordinary measure, but one that's justified by the current circumstances. Certain extra powers will be given to the federal government so that it can help bring the crisis to an end. These will be time-limited and subject to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Crucially, the military will not play an enforcement role. I also know that constituents want to help counter extremism because the government cannot solve this on its own. To them I say, do not despair. Volunteer for a local nonprofit focused on a cause that you care about. Condemn hate and the mistreatment of journalists. Speak up against misinformation. Join a political party that best reflects your values. Volunteer for political candidates you believe in. Most of all, show kindness. Kindness builds trust, and trust between citizens is what ultimately holds democracy together. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Kitchener South Hespeler. The Honourable Member for Kitchener South Hespeler.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in this House today to address something that is affecting all Canadians. My riding of Kitchener South Hespeler is home to 2 Toyota plants, which directly employ over 5,000 employees. The situation at the Ambassador Bridge had a direct impact on the many constituents in my riding who work in the auto sector when the plants were forced to close for several days. Using blockades in cities and at border crossings has disrupted the lives of families across this country. I've heard from constituents in my riding of Kitchener South Hespeler, thousands of whom were sent home from work as a direct result of the blockades. This is hurting our neighbours, crippling the manufacturing industry, disrupting the supply chain, and making life even harder for all Canadians that have already gone through so much. I encourage and ask that all levels of government continue to work together on the current situation at our border crossings and allow Canadians to return to work.
The Honourable Member for Mission Matsqui Fraser Canyon.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, almost 8 months ago, Canadians watched in horror as a devastating wildfire destroyed Lytton. Sadly, there are still no permits issued to rebuild homes or businesses. We are still waiting on debris removal. Residents are still waiting to hear if the land they once called home is ready to rebuild on. Many are worried the living expenses covered by their insurance companies and the Red Cross will run out before construction begins. The municipality itself faces the onerous task of replacing its records lost in the fire. It is still lacking today electricity, water, wastewater, telecommunications, and even a reliable post office. I'd like to recognize the BC government's $8.3 million in funding, but more needs to be done. Lytton needs help. The village cannot wait any longer. My constituents cannot wait any longer. We need to return the community to the people who made Lytton what it was. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
L'honorable député de Laval-les-Îles.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to recognize the 34th anniversary of the Sumgait pogrom, which took place in February 1988, when a large number of Armenians were subjected to mass killing and persecution by Azerbaijani forces as a result of their aspiration to live freely and with dignity. Plusieurs résidents de Laval-les-Îles se souviennent de ces actes horribles et sont découragés de voir que la même politique de haine et de persécution continue de hanter le peuple arménien à ce jour, alors que l'Arménie et l'Artsakh continuent de faire face à une agression sans fin de la part de l'Azerbaïdjan et que bon nombre de leurs militaires continuent d'être détenus illégalement en tant que prisonniers de guerre. I'm confident that through multilateralism, Canada will continue to bring its constructive input in the peaceful and fair resolution of this conflict while ensuring that Armenians and other minorities live peacefully, free of hate and discrimination. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Calgary Confederation.
Mr. Speaker, hard-working Canadians are frustrated with this Liberal government, and rightfully so. We see oil tankers full coming in on the East Coast from dictatorships, from human rights abusers, and those who have no respect for the environment. Yet, our ethically produced, environmentally responsible, job-creating Alberta oil is blocked from getting to the market. Canada is blessed with the third largest proven oil reserves on the planet. We have among the toughest environmental standards and employment standards. We have the foundation to be an energy independent country with enough left over to export. That is why it is so unacceptable that Canada imports energy from 114 other countries. It's time for this Liberal government to end energy imports. It's time for this Liberal government to support Canada's energy independence. It's time for this Liberal government to support Canadians. Annabelle, loud and proud.
The Honourable Member for Regina Louvain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, my Conservative caucus colleagues and I had the distinct privilege of carrying through our motion to review and amend our Canadian Constitution. By unanimously removing a long-standing tax provision that granted special treatment to a large corporation, all members of this House played a critical role in opening up and fixing an error in our Constitution. Although not necessarily a headline-grabbing initiative, removing red tape and unfair provisions of our Constitution is an important task and a part of our responsibility to our constituents that have entrusted us and sent us all here. Tensions have been running high in this House for weeks as we debate issues that are important and have direct impact on the future of all Canadians. Given the fraught environment we currently find ourselves in, it is not lost on me the rarity of finding unanimous consent on any issue, so I thank members of this House, especially my 13 Saskatchewan Conservative colleagues, for the show of unity and getting this important work done. Thank you, and we will always be on Saskatchewan's side. After all, if we don't respect the Constitution, do we have respect for anything?
The Honourable Member for Halifax West.
Mr. Speaker, today I proudly salute the national flag of Canada. It was 57 years ago that our beloved flag was raised on Parliament Hill for the first time. This enduring symbol represents our core national values of democracy and justice. In my life and in my time in public service, I've seen the high regard Canadians and people around the globe have for our flag. I've had the honor of joining countless citizenship ceremonies over the years where new and born Canadians took immense pride both in our flag and in being part of our broader Canadian family. Today, I encourage all Canadians to proudly display the flag, that iconic and internationally recognizable maple leaf, which symbolizes Canada, the land, and its people. Le drapeau national du Canada symbolise l'espoir et la prospérité, ainsi que la paix, la tranquillité et la neutralité. À tous les Canadiens et Canadiennes, happy Flag Day.
The Honourable Member for Courtenay Alberni.
Mr. Speaker, the Nuu-Chah-Nulth people lost a hero last fall. Willard Gallick Sr. was a respected elder of the Sishat First Nation. He passed at the age of 81 following a life of joy and accomplishment. He dedicated his life to standing up for Nuu-Chah-Nulth rights, treaty negotiations, and language and culture. He worked on the docks and was an active member of Local 503 of the International Longshoremen's Union, becoming the first Indigenous person to be elected of their president of their local, and eventually international vice president. I met Willard when he invited me to a Reclaiming Lost Souls for residential school survivor ceremony in 2019. On that day, he told us the residential school was put on Sishat land without permission of his people, but he called for a new beginning. We want to set souls free. We want to send them home, he said. The Indian agent had come for a 6-year-old Willard in 1946, but his dad stood firm, and Willard wasn't taken. You're not taking him, Willard told the story of his dad confronting the agent. And my mom backed him up, he said. It was an act of courage that shaped the life of Kiki Kea, a hero to his people. May he rest in peace.
L'honorable député de Terrebonne.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Nous soulignons aujourd'hui un triste anniversaire. En effet, le 15 février 1839, les 6 derniers des 12 leaders patriotes étaient pendus au pied du courant. Ceux-ci menaient un mouvement de libération nationale. Les patriotes ont combattu en faveur des droits collectifs, de la démocratie et de l'égalité des peuples. Je considère qu'il est de notre devoir de défendre l'héritage des patriotes, héritage qui est aussi celui de ma famille politique et de tous les Québécois, car leur histoire est intimement liée à l'histoire de ma circonscription, Terrebonne. C'est à Terrebonne que la première manifestation au 92 résolution eut lieu. C'est à Terrebonne que fut signé un traité de paix en novembre 1838 entre les loyalistes et les frères chasseurs. Traité de paix trahi ensuite par les autorités britanniques. Le drapeau patriote que j'arbore fièrement n'est pas seulement un symbole de rébellion. C'est le souhait d'un peuple de choisir son destin. Être patriote, ce n'est pas seulement être rebelle, c'est de croire en la démocratie. Merci.
L'honorable député de Chicoutimi-Le-Fjord.
Monsieur le Président, la nuit dernière, un record olympique a été battu aux Jeux olympiques de Beijing et l'équipe canadienne de patinage de vitesse longue piste a remporté la médaille d'or. Félicitations Valérie Maltais, Isabelle Weinman et Ivani Blondin pour cette performance tout à fait spectaculaire. Il y a une belle chimie dans votre trio et vous êtes agréable à suivre. Je tiens à féliciter particulièrement Valérie Maltais, la fierté de la baie. Ton parcours olympique est tout à fait extraordinaire. 4 présences olympiques, 2 médailles dans 2 disciplines différentes. La 3e athlète au monde à être médaillée olympique dans 2 disciplines de patinage de vitesse. C'est pas rien. Ce prix doré est le résultat de tous les sacrifices que ta famille et toi avez fait pendant les 15 dernières années. Ta persévérance, ta détermination ont fait l'athlète que tu es aujourd'hui. Tu es un exemple pour les jeunes à travers le Canada. Félicitations encore Valérie et à tes parents Martine et Gérald. Toute la région est fière de toi. Longue vie à la tradition saguenayenne en patinage de vitesse.
The honourable member for Etobicoke Lakeshore.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to honour Wendell Waggle, who sadly passed in January. He proudly hailed from Windsor, graduated from Osgoode Hall in 1959, and began a career in law that he so dearly loved. I met him and had the honor of working with him at Hughes Amos, Mr. Speaker. The man, or W as he was known, was a giant, an icon, intimidating and inspirational at the same time, but most of all, a true gentleman of the profession. He was a mentor to several generations of lawyers, myself included. A top litigation lawyer, appointed Queen's Counsel in 1972, Wendell was respected by all. He generously shared his knowledge and wisdom both in teaching and serving as president of the Advocate Society and many other organizations. Wendell was kind and giving, a loving husband, stepfather, grandpa, and friend. Wendell will be deeply missed, but not forgotten. Rest in peace, Mr. Waggle.
Oral questions. Question orale. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Invoked the Emergencies Act. 24 hours in and there are more questions than answers. Questions about whether this is justified, questions around if the criteria is met, questions around what this means to Canadians' rights and freedoms. Parliamentary approval is required in order for the Prime Minister to use this unprecedented sledgehammer. So can the Prime Minister tell us when will Parliament be debating this? Will it be coming to us on Friday? And does he expect that we will look at it Friday, but then rise, take a week off, and not actually deal with this until March?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, after discussions with Cabinet and caucus, after consultations with the premiers of all provinces and territories, after conversation with the opposition leaders, we decided to invoke the Emergencies Act to supplement provincial and territorial capacity to address the blockades and occupations. I want to be very clear, Mr. Speaker. The scope of these measures are time-limited and geographically targeted. They are reasonable and proportionate to the threats they are meant to address, and they are fully to be compliant with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms to reassure all Canadians that this is the right thing to move forward with.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
I had a very simple question to the Prime Minister he was not able to answer. It would appear this could be more political drama for the Prime Minister. He name-calls people that he disagrees with. He wedges, he divides, he stigmatizes. Yet in spite of all of his failure, Coote's border has cleared. Windsor has opened up. Provinces and police are doing their jobs, and blockades are starting to come down. But the Prime Minister thinks that now is the time to use this extreme measure and invoke the Emergencies Act. Isn't it true that the Prime Minister's actions could serve to actually make things worse and not make things better?
Exactly. The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, this is about keeping Canadians safe, protecting their communities and neighbourhoods, and ensuring the jobs and our economy.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to interrupt the Right Honourable Prime Minister. I'm trying to hear the answer, and I'm having a very difficult time. There's some shouting going on. I'm going to have to ask the honourable members to maybe just keep it down. And if you've got something that you're not agreeing with, talk amongst yourself with someone next to you. You don't have to shout it out to the person across the floor. The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, you are absolutely right. This is a time for responsible leadership, not crass partisanship. The situation requires additional tools not held by other federal, provincial, or territorial law. It's what responsible leadership requires. These measures must be and will be compliant with the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We will always defend the rights of Canadians to peaceful assembly and to freedom of expression, but these blockades need to end, and unfortunately, Conservative politicians continue to encourage the leaders of these blockades.
Well, Leader of the Opposition.
Well, let's get down to the basics of what this is really about. This is about the Prime Minister's ideological attachment to keeping COVID restrictions and mandates. 63% of Canadians want the restrictions and mandates to end. Conservatives presented a motion yesterday asking simply for a plan, but the Prime Minister is in denial and is ignoring the science. He might as well be back at the cottage because he's doing nothing productive or constructive to help this situation. Can the Prime Minister tell Canadians when he will end the divisive, outdated, and unscientific mandate and restrictions?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, like I said, this is a time for responsible leadership to end these blockades. Unfortunately, the Conservatives continue to play partisan games. The Conservative member of Provencher just yesterday...
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut off the Prime Minister just for a second. And just, I mean, heckling is usually throwing one comment out. Clever, hopefully, although not always necessary. But what I'm hearing is someone bullying and trying to drown someone out. That's not heckling. I just want everyone to take a deep breath, and I'll let the Prime Minister start from the top, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Unfortunately, we see that even in a moment of extremely challenging times, when people are moving forward with responsible leadership and responsible tools, the Conservatives can't help themselves but play crass political games and divide. The Conservative member for Provencher just yesterday embraced the leaders of this blockade and amplified their cause. The Conservative member for Yorkton-Melville said this weekend that blockaders who ripped down fencing around our national war memorial are patriots. The Conservative leadership contender from Carleton continues to say he's proud.
L'honorable député de Louis Saint-Laurent.
Monsieur le Président, pendant 17 jours, le Premier ministre n'a pas levé le petit doigt sur ce qui se passait ici à Ottawa. Plutôt, il a insulté les gens qui ne l'écoutaient pas, qui ne partageaient pas son point de vue. Résultat, Monsieur le Président, hier, le Premier ministre a sorti une loi qu'on n'a pas utilisée pendant un demi-siècle. Il affirme avoir consulté les premiers ministres. C'est faux. Il a plutôt informé les premiers ministres, puisque plus de la moitié des premiers ministres provinciaux sont contre. Le premier ministre Legault a très bien dit en disant que le premier ministre canadien jette de l'huile sur le feu. Pourquoi le premier ministre agit toujours pour camoufler son inaction?
Le très honorable Premier ministre.
Monsieur le Président, depuis les débuts, Nous étions en train de travailler de façon responsable avec les autorités locales, avec les différentes juridictions pour contrer ces barrages illégaux. Et nous allons continuer d'assurer que les polices locales aient tous les outils nécessaires. Et c'est exactement ce qu'on a amené hier, des outils additionnels que la police locale, la police de juridiction locale peut utiliser en cas de barricade et de blocage. Je sais malheureusement que les politiciens conservateurs tendent à appuyer ceux qui barricadent notre économie et nos communautés. Nous tenons d'autres.
L'honorable député de Louis-Saint-Laurent.
Monsieur le Président, tous les Canadiens ont constaté qu'au cours des jours derniers, il y a des situations qui se sont améliorées sans avoir à utiliser la loi sur les mesures d'urgence. Ça s'est passé en Ontario, ça s'est passé en Alberta et ça aurait pu se passer ici à Ottawa. Mais non, Monsieur le Président. Le premier ministre préfère chercher une loi qu'on n'a pas utilisée pendant un demi-siècle, continuer à stigmatiser, à diviser et à insulter ceux qui ne pensent pas comme lui, plutôt que de chercher le compromis. Pourquoi le premier ministre refuse d'écouter les Canadiens qui veulent un premier ministre qui rassemble, comme le pense d'ailleurs son député libéral de Louis Hébert?
Le très honorable premier ministre.
Président, les Canadiens sont tannés de la COVID. Ils sont tannés des restrictions. Ils sont aussi tannés que les gens barricadent leurs rues et bloquent leur accès aux biens et à leurs emplois. C'est pour ça que nous avons dû prendre des mesures responsables pour permettre aux provinces et aux juridictions locales de garder nos chaînes d'approvisionnement et nos rues libres de manifestations illégales. Nous allons toujours être là pour appuyer nos forces de l'ordre avec des outils qui sont soumis à la Charte des droits et libertés et pour protéger les valeurs et la...
L'honorable député de Belleuil-Chambly.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Ottawa a perdu le contrôle sur Ottawa. Pourtant, la situation au pont des Ambassadeurs a été réglée sans la loi sur les mesures d'urgence. La situation à Cass et la saisie d'armes s'est faite sans la loi sur les mesures d'urgence. La situation au Québec a été très bien gérée sans la loi sur les mesures d'urgence. Le premier ministre a pris un engagement hier à circonscrire géographiquement les interventions en vertu du décret. Or, le décret, il ne dit pas ça, pantoute. Est-ce que le premier ministre s'engage à soustraire expressément le Québec de l'application de son décret?
Bravo! Le très honorable premier ministre.
Monsieur le Président, la loi sur les mesures d'urgence donne des outils additionnels aux policiers à travers le pays en cas de situation d'urgence, comme on a vu un peu partout au pays. Effectivement, dans bien des endroits au pays, ils ont pu bien gérer ces barricades, mais on sait que les risques demeurent et donc la police de juridiction locale au Québec et ailleurs vont avoir des outils supplémentaires s'ils en ont besoin. Monsieur le Président, c'est des mesures proportionnées, responsables, qui vont s'appliquer seulement en cas de besoin par la police locale.
Le député de Belleuil-Chambly.
Monsieur le Président, les partis à l'Assemblée nationale du Québec n'en veulent pas. Le gouvernement du Québec n'en veut pas. Le Bloc québécois n'en veut pas. Et j'entends dans les banquettes voisines que les gens de l'Alberta n'en veulent pas, de la Saskatchewan n'en veulent pas, Manitoba n'en veulent pas. Est-ce que le premier ministre se magasine son moment « Just Watch Me » en imposant une loi au Québec contre le Québec?
Bravo! Le très honorable premier ministre.
Président, cette loi sur les mesures d'urgence s'applique contre les barricades illégales, les occupations illégales qui se trouvent à surgir ici et là partout au pays. C'est une réponse que nous avons mis de l'avant qui est responsable, qui est proportionnée, qui est limitée et dans le temps et dans son application géographique et qui est toujours en train de protéger les valeurs et les libertés à l'intérieur de la Charte des droits et libertés. Nous sommes en train de réagir de façon responsable et nous allons continuer d'être là pour les Canadiens qui en souffrent.
Honorable député de Burnaby Sud.
Sadly, we are in this crisis because we've seen a failure to take this crisis seriously at all levels of government. And now we're seeing Indigenous and racialized people look at the double standard that the convoy is being treated as compared to those protesters. And we also have deeply disturbing reports of military and police personnel who've expressed sympathy and support for the convoy. So will the Prime Minister provide assurances in this House that the police will use the powers given to protect people and not support the occupation?
Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the measured and responsible use of the Emergencies Act that we announced yesterday gives specific, time-limited, proportional tools to police of local jurisdiction and their partners to be able to ensure that these illegal blockades end, to make sure that people who have now fully been heard by all Canadians choose to go home. These are the things that Canadians expect from their orders of government, and I can say that we have worked extremely closely across orders of government with all different polices of jurisdiction to ensure that Canadians get their streets and their lives back.
Well, member for Burnaby South.
On est dans une crise nationale et on a vu les impacts de cette crise. Des armes étaient trouvées à Coutts et la situation s'empire à Ottawa. Donc, c'est bien clair qu'on doit mettre fin à l'occupation. Mais c'est aussi clair qu'il n'y a pas d'occupation au Québec. Donc, le Premier ministre, est-ce qu'il est prêt de s'engager que les mesures d'urgence ne vont pas être appliquées ou il n'est pas nécessaire?
Très honorable Premier ministre.
Monsieur le Président, cette loi sur les mesures d'urgence met de l'avant des outils supplémentaires pour les gouvernements locaux, pour les policiers locaux, appuyés par la GRC en cas de besoin. Nous n'allons pas imposer des mesures nulle part au pays où ils ne sont pas besoin. C'est des outils que la police de juridiction locale peut utiliser ou non à leur discrétion, mais c'est une question de s'assurer que nous avons tous les outils nécessaires pour s'assurer que nous en finissons avec ces barricades illégales.
The honourable member for Sturgeon River Parkland.
Mr. Speaker, the invocation of the Emergencies Act for the first time in Canadian history is a damning indictment on the failure of this Prime Minister to address the situation. The Prime Minister once said, I quote, "When a government asks its citizens to give up even a small portion of their liberty, it is not simply enough to say, trust us. That trust must be earned, it must be checked, and it must be renewed." These are his words. Canadians do not trust this Prime Minister. When will he stop undermining Canadians' rights and start renewing Canadians' trust?
The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians can trust that this government will always follow the science and the best evidence to get us out of this pandemic, and that includes getting vaccinated, Mr. Speaker. And contrary to what my colleague says, this is an illegal blockade. This illegal blockade is not about the vaccines or the mandates. It's about a very small organized group who are trying to upend our way of life, Mr. Speaker. Now, we've made progress. We've seen the Ambassador Bridge reopened. We've seen Coutts reopened. We've seen Surrey reopened. And, Mr. Speaker, yesterday, yes, we invoked the Emergencies Act so that we can secure that progress and give law enforcement all of the tools they need. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Sturgeon River Parkland.
Well, we'll see if the Prime Minister answers this one. Every opportunity he has had to de-escalate this situation in Ottawa and around Canada, he has chosen to hide, to confront, and to escalate. His divisive conduct has been a lesson in abject failure. Blockades should come down. They are already coming down across this country. But now the Prime Minister has invoked the Emergencies Act to punish Canadians who, in his words, hold unacceptable views. Why is the Prime Minister punishing Canadians for their political views?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
That the former Conservative leader, now the member for Regina Capel with the Conservative Party, said the following: "These protesters, these activists, may have the luxury of spending days at a time at a blockade, but they need to check their privilege. They need to check their privilege and let the people whose jobs depend on the railway system and small business and farmers do their jobs." And what have they said now in this context from the beginning? As swastikas flew, as Confederate flags flew, they went out and they gave coffee. They took pictures. They have absolutely the opposite of responsible leadership. Instead of de-escalating, they escalated at every turn.
Can we go on? L'honorable député de Portneuf, Jean Cartier.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Nous voulons tous dénouer l'impasse devant le Parlement ici à Ottawa et que ça finisse rapidement et pacifiquement. L'inaction de ce gouvernement les oblige à faire du rattrapage et imposer la loi des mesures d'urgence. Ils auraient avantage à s'inspirer des premiers ministres des provinces qui ont réussi, eux, à contrôler les manifestations sans loi spéciale. Est-ce que le premier ministre s'engage à ne pas utiliser les pouvoirs des mesures d'urgence dans les nombreuses provinces qui s'y opposent?
Il n'est même pas là. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Le président, c'était l'ancien chef du Parti conservateur, qui est le député aujourd'hui pour Regina-Capelle, qui a dit à ce moment-là que ce n'était pas acceptable d'avoir une manifestation qui bloque des infrastructures critiques. Et qu'est-ce que le Parti conservateur fait aujourd'hui? Le Parti conservateur aujourd'hui est là de prendre des photos, de tweets et d'encourager des manifestations. Quand le coût pour ça est le milliard de dollars, c'est pas responsable, c'est absolument irresponsable.
L'honorable député de Portneuf, Jacques Cartier.
Monsieur le Président, c'est le gouvernement qui est irresponsable. Je vais répéter ma question et j'invite le leader à écouter la question. L'île du Prince-Édouard, le Nouveau-Brunswick, l'Alberta, le Québec n'en veulent pas des mesures sanitaires. Qu'entend le gouvernement doit s'engager à ne pas obliger les provinces à subir les mesures sanitaires.
Exactement. L'honorable chef du parti dans la Chambre.
Responsable. Chaque député te protège la loi, te protège les Canadiens et les Canadiennes. Ça, c'est une responsabilité pour chaque député. C'est pas juste le gouvernement du Canada. C'est pas juste cette côté de Chambre des communes. Et je veux dire clairement, c'est le temps d'arrêter de tweet et d'appuyer les personnes qui manifestent à l'extérieur. On doit arrêter la manifestation. C'est le temps de faire l'action raisonnable et c'est le temps pour le Parti conservateur de continuer de act responsibly, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Calgary, Midnapore.
Are you done now? For 2 years, the Prime Minister has insisted he is making decisions based...
I just want to remind the honourable members to place their questions through the Speaker. I'll let her restart her question.
Sorry, Mr. Speaker.
From the top.
Again, my apologies. For 2 years, the Prime Minister has insisted he is making decisions based on science. Canadians sacrificed, they isolated, closed businesses, got vaccinated because experts advised it was the safest way forward. Now, those same experts say it is time to ease restrictions. Premiers are listening, but this Prime Minister believes he knows better and has invoked the Emergency Measures Act. Does the Prime Minister intend to force provinces to implement measures they and science disagree with?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
I'll tell you what I'm done with. I'm done with seeing as this protest continues, as illegal actions continue that cost billions of dollars to businesses, that terrorize downtown residents. I am tired of seeing conservative tweets, such as the member from Bravanchet who's saying that he supports it, the member for Yorkton Melville saying that that ripping down barricades in front of a war memorial is a patriotic act, watching somebody who aspires to be leader of Conservative Party saying that what's happening outside is something he stands by. That is enough. Please, it's time to end this. Stop supporting what's going on outside.
The honourable member for Calgary, Midnapore.
Mr. Speaker, the rest of the world is opening up and returning to normal. Where the science supports it, provinces are providing Canadians with hope for the first time in 2 years, contrary to this Prime Minister, whose lack of leadership has brought him to invoke the Emergency Measures Act, traumatizing Canadians. He is well aware that many provinces are opposed to these measures. He is also well aware that the science says that they are not needed. Will this Prime Minister force provinces to implement measures that they had independently decided to remove?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, Canada has one of the lowest death rates in the world, one of the highest vaccination rates in the world. It has met the challenge of this pandemic. But what has not been met in this hour of history is that as the chaos descended outside, as protesters began to shut down critical infrastructure, we had lawmakers, people of this House, going out and encouraging their activity. And I have to ask, Mr. Speaker, if they didn't have lawmakers who were elected by constituents encouraging their illegal actions, when would this have been over? I think it would have been over a lot sooner.
L'honorable député d'Avignon-Lamitis-Matane-Matapédia.
Monsieur le Président, le Premier ministre a déclaré hier que la loi sur les mesures d'urgence n'était pas quelque chose à prendre à la légère. Bien, en effet, la loi n'a jamais été utilisée depuis son adoption en 1988. C'est pas mêlant, Monsieur le Président, je n'étais même pas née. C'est le dernier des derniers recours. Le Premier ministre le dit lui-même, et je le cite, ce n'est pas le premier outil que l'on prend, même le deuxième ou le troisième. Mais il n'en a pas utilisé de premier outil, ni de deuxième, ni de troisième outil. Il en a utilisé zéro avant de débarquer avec la plus extrême des options. Est-ce que c'est vraiment raisonnable?
Bravo. L'honorable ministre de la Sécurité publique.
Monsieur le Président, je veux remercier ma collègue pour la question. Et c'est vrai qu'on avait fait beaucoup de progrès sur le terrain, à la frontière, à Surrey, à Coutts, même au Windsor, où maintenant le pont d'Ambassadeur est réouvert. C'est bon pour le commerce. Mais hier, on avait invoqué la loi sur les mesures d'urgence pour offrir des outils nouveaux et innovatifs pour aider les services de policiers pour terminer cette blocade illégale. Ça, c'est le focus de notre gouvernement. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
L'honorable député d'Avignon-Lamitis-Matane-Matapédia.
Monsieur le Président, je vais vous le dire ce qu'a pas fait le gouvernement. Le premier ministre n'est pas entré en communication avec les assiégeants du Parlement depuis 19 jours. Il n'a pas envoyé sa part des 1800 agents des forces de l'ordre demandés par la Ville d'Ottawa. Il n'a pas créé de cellule de crise incluant à la fois tous les paliers de gouvernement et tous les corps de police. Il n'a pas consulté ses partenaires du Québec et des provinces avant de les informer de sa décision d'utiliser la loi sur les mesures d'urgence. Le premier ministre croit-il vraiment que cette loi doit être la première action réelle du gouvernement pour répondre au siège d'Ottawa?
Bravo. Bravo. L'honorable ministre.
Monsieur le Président, avec beaucoup de respect à ma collègue, peut-être elle a manqué les nouvelles. Il y a 3 installations de services policiers pour aider les services ici au Ottawa. Et les membres de la GRC avaient fait beaucoup de bon travail, pas seulement au Ottawa, mais au Windsor, où maintenant le pont Ambassadeur est réouvert. C'est bon pour l'économie, c'est bon pour tout le monde. Mais il faut aussi d'explorer des nouveaux outils pour aider les services policiers pour terminer cette blocade et cette convoi illégal. Merci.
Le député d'Avignon-Lamitis-Matane-Matapédia.
Monsieur le Président, le premier ministre du Québec a été clair. Le Québec n'a pas besoin de la loi sur les mesures d'urgence. Le gouvernement du Québec en veut pas. L'Assemblée nationale s'oppose unanimement à ce que ce décret s'applique au Québec. Pourtant, le premier ministre, qui hier avait dit que ce serait localisé géographiquement, arrive avec un décret qui s'applique partout au Canada, incluant au Québec. Pourquoi le premier ministre, qui prétend consulter, a-t-il décidé d'ignorer encore une fois la demande du Québec? Pourquoi la loi sur les mesures d'urgence s'applique-t-elle au Québec?
Bravo! L'honorable ministre de la Sécurité publique.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je veux rassurer ma collègue qu'on va continuer d'offrir des ressources dans le contexte les autorités dans les lois. Mais hier, on avait invoqué les lois sur les mesures d'urgence. Cette loi est temporaire, ce sont géographiques spécifiques et les mesures sont ciblées. Et cet utile vont être implémentés en concert avec les provinces et les territoires, même au Québec. Merci.
The honourable member for Peterborough-Kawartha.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday during a press conference, the Prime Minister said, and I quote, "Some people will say we moved too quickly. Other people will say, no, we should have acted weeks ago. The reality is this. The Emergencies Act is not something to take lightly. It is not the first thing you turn to, nor the second, nor the third. So my question is, Mr. Speaker, can the Prime Minister please tell Canadians what first, second, and third actions he took before invoking the emergency?
The Honourable Minister for Emergency Preparedness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, right from the outset of the blockades and the disruptions that were taking place in Ottawa, and then the blockades at our critical infrastructure at our ports of entry, our government has worked with municipal and provincial partners right across the country in order to ensure that they had the resources and the support they needed to keep Canadians safe.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to ask the minister to repeat. I'm right next to you, or to the honourable member, and I can't hear it because of the shouting. If I can ask the honourable minister to start from the top so that at least I can hear it, and hopefully the honourable member for Peterborough-Kawartha can hear the answer.
Mr. Speaker, I'm actually very glad to see that the Conservatives have once again changed their position on something important. Whereas first they supported these blockades, and now they recognize that this is a largely foreign-funded, targeted, and coordinating attack on Canadian critical infrastructure. They flip-flop. Good for them. We're all getting used to it.
The member for Peterborough-Kawartha.
Mr. Speaker, I think the person or the party that is flip-flopped is the Liberals. Last week, you said you had all the tools you needed, they needed to do this. And now we have an Emergency Measures Act.
Yeah.
We were told we would never need federal vaccine mandates. That changed. Now you're saying it's just jurisdiction. How can we trust this government? How much authority does the Prime Minister need to set an unprecedented Emergency Measures Act? How much authority does he need?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the evidence is clear. A largely foreign-funded, targeted, and coordinating attack on critical Canadian infrastructure at our borders is hurting Canada and harming Canadians. And, Mr. Speaker, it was equally clear that we needed to do more and we would have to do what was required. Mr. Speaker, we've introduced measures that will create greater financial scrutiny and financial consequences for the people who are engaged in this criminal behavior. The evidence of firearms at Coots elevates the risk to Canadian security and safety, and we will do what is required to keep Canadians safe.
The Honourable Member for Saskatoon West.
Mr. Speaker, last Friday, the Prime Minister said that the Ottawa Police had enough resources to deal with the protesters.
That's right.
And on Monday, he calls for emergency measures. Boy, that escalated quickly. He had 17 days to act, and after hiding at his cottage on his MacBook for the first week, he did nothing but divide and stigmatize. Mr. Speaker, the constituents in Saskatoon West want to know what changed in the Prime Minister's mind over the weekend to justify such drastic measures.
The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, I want to assure my colleague that the RCMP has been supporting and aiding the Ottawa Police Service to enforce public safety, not only here in Ottawa, but in Windsor, where we've reopened the Ambassador Bridge, in Coots, where the border's reopened, in Surrey, where the border's reopened, and that's good. It's good for the economy. It's good for Canadians who can get back to work, Mr. Speaker. And yesterday's invocation of the Emergencies Act is meant to secure those gains so that we give the police all of the tools that they need, whether it's declaring certain zones which are adjacent to our borders, to our national symbols, Mr. Speaker. It's important for the Conservatives to ask those participating in the illegal blockades to now go home.
The Honourable Member for Niagara Falls.
Mr. Speaker, for too long, Conservatives have been calling on this government to remove the mandatory PCR test requirements for those entering Canada. In my riding of Niagara Falls, this policy has had a devastating impact on our economy. Visits from the U.S. are nowhere near the record levels reached in 2019, and these expensive costs put on our visitors and Canadians traveling prevent them from visiting their families and loved ones. My residents want to know this: when will all federal travel mandates be ended?
The Honourable Minister of Transport.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my honourable colleague for giving me the opportunity to share with him and all members of this House and all Canadians the great announcement that myself and our colleagues made today. Today, based on the science and the public health advice we received, we eased our travel measure, including, Mr. Speaker, allowing incoming travelers to use an antigen test instead of the PCR test, pre-departure test. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Windsor West.
Unlawful blockades at the borders across the country, including Windsor and Coots, have been shown that the Liberals have not done the proper, serious work necessary to ensure that our borders are protected and the citizens that live nearby are safe. These illegal blockades have hurt every Canadian by hurting thousands of people from getting to work and supporting their families. We have long been calling for a safe border task force reinstate cuts from the CBSA intelligence, and also to make sure that municipalities are reinstated for their costs. To the Prime Minister, will he finally listen to our calls to ensure that safe borders are going to happen, or he's going to continue to listen to extremists? The bridge might be open now, but the threat hasn't stopped. Will he act?
The Honourable Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I share my honourable colleague's concern, and I can inform the House that I've been in routine contact with him, as well as the municipal leaders in Windsor, including the Mayor of Windsor. And I've assured him, and the government will continue to provide all of the resources that the community of Windsor needs to keep that bridge open. That means, yes, making sure that police have the assets that they need, be it tow trucks, be it barriers, be it whatever resources, so that we can keep the economy rolling, the bridge open, and get Canadians back to work. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Strathcona.
And what about Alberta? You know, Mr. Speaker, yesterday the RCMP arrested 13 extremists blockading the border at Coutts. They seized guns, ammunition, and body armor, including assault weapons with thousands of rounds. This comes after convoy leaders raised millions from foreign donors with a stated goal to overthrow the government. And while I'm happy to see that the blockade appears to be ending in Alberta, the fact remains that we had an armed militia active in Alberta. This is unthinkable. Why did it take 18 days and proof of an armed threat to make the government act and protect Albertans and Canadians?
Minister for Emergency Preparedness.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the member for that very important question, and I think it does reveal, and we agree, that what we have seen in Coutts, Alberta, and in a number of these blockades, illegal blockades across the country, is that the threat is not yet gone. And that's precisely why, Mr. Speaker, we've introduced through these measures of the Emergency Act that we introduced yesterday, that will increase, for example, the financial scrutiny and consequences of these illegal acts, that will also make available equipment and authorities that our law enforcement officials need to maintain and restore public safety and to protect Canada's interests.
Well, Member for Davenport.
Mr. Speaker, since the Government of Canada announced its ambitious plan for a $10 a day early learning and childcare system across the country, we have signed agreements with 9 provinces and 3 territories. Already in some provinces, families are seeing a reduction in their childcare fees, making life more affordable. But those in my riding of Davenport in downtown West Toronto are wondering, when is Ontario going to sign on? And when will they too be able to benefit from our national childcare program? Can the there any updates on the federal government's efforts to reach a childcare agreement with Ontario?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my honourable colleague from Davenport for that important question. We have now signed agreements with 12 provinces and territories across the country. That means that families from coast to coast to coast, except for in Ontario at this point in time, will have access to 50% reduction in fees by the end of this calendar year. Mr. Speaker, I remain very optimistic that we will sign an agreement with Ontario. There is a fair deal on the table, $10.2 billion that will go to helping families decrease the costs of childcare and make life more affordable.
Well, Member for Abbotsford.
Our Canadians are stressed. Paychecks don't buy what they used to. In fact, the cost of everything, gasoline, groceries, housing, is at all-time highs. Families are getting left behind. So last April, I wrote to the minister to warn her of exactly that. I highlighted the dangers of uncontrolled borrowing and how excessive stimulus spending would stoke inflationary pressures. She either doesn't care or didn't read my letter. So to the minister, what specifically is she doing to get inflation under control?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives continue, actually in all aspects of Canadian life, to put forward a false narrative. And the latest false narrative we've just been hearing today is about the economy. The reality is that the Canadian economy is recovering strongly from the COVID recession. In the third quarter, our GDP grew by 5.4%. That is higher than the US, Japan, the UK, and Australia. And you know what, Mr. Speaker? When it comes to our debt-to-GDP ratio, our AAA credit rating was reaffirmed in the fall by S&P and Moody's.
The Honourable Member for Abbotsford.
Well, we will never get inflation under control as long as that minister keeps borrowing and spending like there's no tomorrow.
Not only did the minister ignore our concerns, she also ignored the warnings of the parliamentary budget officer, who questioned the wisdom of her stimulus spending, pumping more money into the economy when the cost of living is skyrocketing. This minister is making this crisis worse. This problem is not transitory. Month by month, the inflation numbers are going up. When will the minister finally do something to protect Canadians against the skyrocketing cost of living?
Right to the Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
You know, Mr. Speaker, the real question is, when will the Conservatives stick with a policy or stick with a leader? Because I was on the campaign trail in the summer, and so were the members opposite, and they actually campaigned on proposed government spending higher than our own proposal. We proposed a deficit for 21-22 of $156.9 billion. They campaigned on a proposed deficit of $168 billion. So I wonder if the party of flip-flops can tell Canadians where they stand today.
The Honourable Member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The excise escalator tax increase will crush wineries, breweries, cideries, and distilleries' bottom line. The excise escalator tax is automatic. And here's the kicker. It's based on the CPI index, meaning because inflation is so high, the tax will be even higher than ever before starting April 1st. This tax is based on inflation. It's taxing inflation, which will make inflation go up even more on these important value-added agricultural products. So will the Liberals commit to cancel this inflationary excise tax increase?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
You know, Mr. Speaker, it is a bit rich of the Conservatives to be talking about supporting small businesses of any kind in this country. After all, Mr. Speaker, this is the party which, when we, before Christmas, proposed absolutely essential support for small business to help them get through Omicron, what did the Conservatives do at that crucial moment? They voted against our measures. So really, Mr. Speaker, we will take no lessons about supporting business from them.
The Honourable Member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. That wasn't an answer to my question at all. When Canadian winery, brewery, cidery, and distillery workers wake up and owners on April 1st, they'll be hit with this automatic tax increase on excise thanks to the Liberals. 95% of these producers are small businesses who have already been hit with payroll tax increases, labor shortages, increases in debt, and slower sales due to perpetual lockdowns. Now is not the time to be increasing any taxes on small businesses. So will the Liberals cancel this bad April Fool's Day tax increase?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, let me tell you what hurts Canadian small businesses. What hurts Canadian small businesses is when, solely for the sake of partisan posturing, people who were elected to this House to support the small businesses in their communities oppose the small business support that small businesses themselves are calling for. And you know what else has hurt Canadian businesses, small ones and big ones too? The blockade of the Ambassador Bridge. And members on that side of the House were giving succor and encouragement to those blockades. That is unacceptable, Mr. Speaker.
L'honorable député de Montarville.
Monsieur le Président, c'est aujourd'hui, 15 février, le jour de l'unifolié. Le Canada célèbre son drapeau. Ah ben pour être célébré, Monsieur le Président, il est célébré. On le voit partout, plus que jamais, dans les rues du centre-ville d'Ottawa. Il flotte dans des manifestations aux États-Unis, en France, en Nouvelle-Zélande. Le drapeau canadien est littéralement devenu l'emblème international de mouvements qui dérivent parfois jusqu'à vouloir renverser des gouvernements démocratiquement élus. Le premier ministre réalise-t-il que sa réaction à l'occupation de sa capitale...
Honorable ministre.
Monsieur le Président, je tiens à remercier mon collègue de souligner l'anniversaire de l'unifolié, notre drapeau qui nous unit tous et chacun, Monsieur le Président, en particulier les fiers députés du Québec, du côté du gouvernement, qui sont de fiers Canadiens également, mais aussi de fiers Canadiens de l'autre côté, Monsieur le Président. Et je pense que c'est important qu'on prenne ce temps-là. Je tiens à remercier mon collègue. Merci beaucoup de l'avoir souligné, Monsieur le Président, pour qu'on puisse tous célébrer ensemble l'anniversaire de l'unifolié.
L'honorable député de Montarville.
Monsieur le Président, la réaction mièvre du gouvernement jusqu'à présent a fait en sorte que non seulement c'est la risée internationale, mais une incitation internationale planétaire au désordre. Questionné hier quant à l'effet de la crise sur la réputation internationale du Canada, justement, le premier ministre a répondu qu'à son avis, le point tournant a été le blocus du pont Ambassadeur. Mais le point tournant, c'est plutôt lorsque les occupants ont assiégé la capitale de son pays sans susciter la moindre réaction de sa part. Après 19 jours d'inaction, il annonce vouloir recourir à l'arme nucléaire des dispositions législatives, les mesures d'urgence. Comment est-ce possible d'être à ce point...
L'honorable ministre.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Puisque nous sommes encore en train de parler de l'unifolié, je pense que c'est important de dire ce qu'il représente, ce qu'il symbolise à l'échelle de la planète. Cette fierté, non seulement pour nous d'être Canadiens, mais le rôle que le Canada a joué à travers l'histoire dans la résolution de conflits, dans l'aide publique au développement. Cette main tendue que tous les Canadiens, incluant les Québécois, ont par réflexe, Monsieur le Président, de faire en sorte, encore une fois, Monsieur le Président, je remercie mon collègue de nous rappeler, c'est important de souligner, de célébrer l'unifolié.
The honourable member for Bay of Quinte.
Mr. Speaker, for weeks, Canadians looking for hope have been looking for a Prime Minister to listen to their concerns and listen to their needs as the rest of the world opened up. Instead, they heard from a Prime Minister with an escalating tone that left them feeling traumatized, stigmatized, and divided. Even today, he's calling out and blaming other parties who have been listening instead of pitting Canadian versus Canadian and showing real leadership. Yeah. Why do Canadians have to pay with their freedoms to cover up for this government's failed leadership?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I think we have different definitions of division. To me, when critical infrastructure is being blocked, when illegal protesters are outside, when we see swastikas and Confederate flags going out and taking photographs and giving coffee, I don't think that's healthy for the country, Mr. Speaker. Instead, what I think would be healthy is to say to those that would seek to divide us, those that would seek to exploit our differences, to say those kinds of radical views do not have a place in this country. It's time to go home, it's time to end this illegal activity, and it's time to come together as a country.
The honourable member for Dauphin, Swan River, Minipoa.
Mr. Speaker, I sent out a survey last month asking my constituents what was their biggest concerns. The cost of living was the #1 issue. One of my constituents, named Rick, wrote to me and stated, "The food prices are out of my pay range." Mr. Speaker, inflation is at record highs due to this Liberal government's spending. So what does the Prime Minister have to say to Rick, who can't afford to put food on his table?
Good question. The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, our government absolutely understands that affordability matters for Canadian families, and that's why we are there for them. We lowered taxes for the middle class and raised them on the wealthiest 1%. We created the Canada Child Benefit, which is indexed to inflation, and now a single mother with 2 children can receive up to $13,600 from the CCB. The Climate Action Incentive gives the average family in Alberta $981, in Saskatchewan $961, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Simcoe North.
Mr. Speaker, at the beginning of COVID, all the parties came together to support relief programs for Canadians and businesses. Now the economy is opening up, but the government's money printing press is still humming. Experts are now warning this government what members of this side of the House have been warning for some time, that this government's future spending plan will lead to more inflation. Mr. Speaker, let's give the minister one last chance. When will this government rein in its out-of-control spending?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as I pointed out a moment ago, it is actually the members opposite, the members of the party of flip-flops, who campaigned on a platform which proposed higher spending in this fiscal year than we proposed. So let's remind Canadians of that. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to supporting small business, it was this party, contrary to what the member just asserted, that opposed the essential support small businesses needed that we proposed before Christmas.
The honourable member for Vancouver, Granville.
Monsieur le Président, les parents de ma circonscription comprennent que l'inscription de leurs enfants à des programmes d'immersion en français les enrichit culturellement et leur donne un avantage plus tard dans la vie. Cependant, en raison de la pénurie d'enseignants et des longues listes d'attente, il est souvent difficile de s'inscrire à l'immersion française. La ministre des Langues officielles pourrait-elle dire à la Chambre comment notre gouvernement donne à plus d'enfants la possibilité d'apprendre le français?
Honorable ministre des Langues officielles.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Je tiens à remercier mon ami et mon collègue de Vancouver-Granville pour son excellente question. Notre gouvernement reconnaît qu'offrir l'opportunité d'apprentissage en français aujourd'hui signifie d'avoir plus d'adultes bilingues dans l'avenir. Dans le budget 2021, nous investissons dans l'élimination des listes d'attente et nous travaillons avec nos partenaires des provinces et des territoires pour continuer à améliorer l'accès de la langue française. Nous allons continuer à travailler avec les communautés, Monsieur le Président. Merci beaucoup.
The honourable member for South Shore, St. Margaret's.
Today, more fishermen have been lost at sea, and our hearts go out to them. Captains know the risk of sinking while fishing. What Adam Newell wasn't counting on was losing his vessel while tied up at a DFO wharf.